Business leaders know the future is already here. The economy is shifting. Non-humans are entering the workforce. Nothing feels certain. SHRM understands those evolving challenges, both in the workplace and the wider world. In this podcast, we'll bring together authors, researchers, executives, and non-traditional experts to help you take on the challenges others haven't yet considered. Because you don't need to be a futurist, you need actionable insights now. You need to be a Tomorrowist. I'm Jerry Wan. Welcome to Tomorrowist, where we explore the trends shaping the future of work. This week, we're talking cybersecurity. Technology often gets the spotlight, but it's people who pose the greatest risks and the greatest opportunities for protecting organizations. With insider threats on the rise, leaders are realizing that cybersecurity is as much about culture as it is about firewalls. Joining us to share her experience in insider threats and human risk management is Shawnee Delaney, CEO of Vaillance Group. Shawnee, welcome to Tomorrowist.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm excited for this conversation. It's not every episode or not every day I get to talk to a former spy. And so your experience spans both the public and the private sector in a lot of departments that we'd be familiar with. And so not only the things that are changing that affect our work and our lives, but the pace of change is accelerating. And so with all the things that are impacting our daily work, with a lot of the geopolitical things that are happening, I'm really excited to share with our audience your expertise. So let's start off the top. Cybersecurity, when we hear that term, the obvious thing that people think about are technologies, tools, things you have to, your phones, basically technology, gates and tools. Can you share how your background in intelligence and espionage informs your perspective on the human element of the cybersecurity risk that we're talking about today?
Yeah, I think this is something that is obviously very near and dear to my heart. When people hear the word cybersecurity, they usually picture firewalls in the cloud or antivirus or some IT guy in a hoodie, like sitting in his mom's basement. But from my background in intelligence and espionage, I see it totally different. I'm looking at all of this with a different lens because I've lived in that human layer of risk. So as a spy, my job was to recruit vulnerable insiders to commit treason. I hacked people. I built trust and I mirrored behavior and I asked the right questions and I got individuals to basically hand me the very secrets that they were trained to protect. And that's social engineering. That's social engineering at its core, and it works because humans are really the softest target in any system. So then you have to fast forward to today. When you look at it, the exact same tactics that I used overseas are now being used by all kinds of threat actors. You've got nation states, you've got fraud rings, you've got organized criminal groups, you've got hackers, and all of these groups are using natural human traits to get what they want. Then you add in the layer of AI, which is essentially just lowered the barrier to entry for all of these malicious actors. And it doesn't take months or years of cultivating a relationship like it took me. AI can mimic your boss's voice or your spouse's writing style or image, or even like your kids' like panicked text messages. And it can convince you to hand over information in seconds. And what it does is these threat actors are tapping into your amygdala, that part of your brain that processes emotion. And when the amygdala feels fear or anxiety or stress, it hijacks that brain and it can't process other emotions. So for me, this is why HR and people ops matter so much, is because technology can block, 90% of external attacks, maybe, but it's the human element. It's the skin behind the keyboard, both from the threat actor side and from the victim side. And you have things like stress and distraction and trust, and all of those things open the door. So if we don't understand how humans actually think or react and make decisions under pressure, then all of the tech and all of the cool tools in the world will not save us. So my perspective is that cybersecurity is not just about protecting data, it's about protecting people, because they're both the first line of defense and the easiest way in.
I think, two things come to mind, and I'm sure our audience can resonate too. One is sort of the old school training that most of us had to do in corporate America, which is, point out the phishing email, and it's so poorly written and bluntly obvious. And it's like, hey, who would fall for this? Fast forward to today, I'm probably getting 1 or 2 text messages a day from phishing people, right? Or, hey, your subscription, you paid, is this invoice good? And it's scary because we are being attacked or at least attempted every single day. And, we can talk about just the variety of attacks or types of attempts that are being made, the vulnerable populations, particularly our seniors on the, sort of the individual levels that are being targeted. And we, unfortunately hear so much on the news about that. But when we think about this from an organizational perspective, right, of course, losing money or giving up your passwords from a individual perspective is a great danger and something that we should talk about from an organizational perspective. I gather, and I think you'd agree that the risks are far greater, particularly if your organization works with, governmental agencies or controls either data or finances that can impact, at far greater lengths. How prepared are organizations today to identify and manage that human risk?
Honestly, most organizations today are not prepared at all to identify and manage human risk. First of all, I think the vast majority don't think that it can happen to them. I actually see it every day with people that I work with. They they think that they are because they bought these shiny tech tools and they run these terrible, like you said, these annual security awareness trainings. So they think they're prepared. But when you really look at it and you really peel it back, the real work, the spotting and addressing of those human factors is often missing. So the gap is companies are great at measuring like patch updates and phishing click rates and things like that, but they're not so great at measuring employee stress or disengagement or financial strain or cultural toxicity. And those are the things that lead to insider threats, the mistakes or people cutting corners. So it's like you're trying, like the best analogy I can come up with is you're trying to protect a house by locking the front door, but you're actually leaving all of the windows wide open. So sure, you've secured something, but the vulnerabilities really are still everywhere. I will add also the other issue is that human risk doesn't really have a clear owner. When I build programs for companies, every company's different. Some people want it under legal or HR or security, right? So you've got security teams that think that HR should handle it because it's a people thing. And then HR thinks it's security's job. And then security thinks it's IT's job. And leadership assumes that compliance will catch it. So it really just falls into the cracks until there's a breach or something bad happens, right? So I think overall, if you look at it, like the truth is insider threat, it's not an IT problem, it's a people problem. I will probably say that 10 more times in this conversation, but organizations have to treat it that way. And they have to embed human risk management into the hiring and training and performance management and offboarding and all of these things that relate to HR.
And then what are some of the most common human-driven risks that organizations face today in light of all the things that we're talking about?
Yeah, I would say some of the most common, and a lot of them are AI driven now, but phishing and social engineering is probably the number one way. Just people clicking the wrong link and trusting that link because humans are wired to trust and they're wired to move fast. And like I mentioned, these threat actors, attackers, they're exploiting that. So now they're using, like I mentioned, AI and they're making these phishing emails or they're making voice clones or deep fakes that are indistinguishable from the real thing. And there's surveys out that say over half of organizations have no training in how to spot a deepfake, for example. Also with AI and these threat actors, what they're doing is they're scraping the internet. They're pulling information from open source, from LinkedIn, from social media. And it's not just you or your profile. Some people are like, Shawnee, I don't have social media. Well, that's peachy. But your kids, your parents, your neighbors, your friends, your colleagues, those people do. And so threat actors just need to pull these pieces together to make the puzzle whole. And then they build targeting packages. And I have a great example if you want. I was actually hacked by a nation state. And what they did was they targeted it specifically to me. So I had a friend who used Proton as an email, a secure encrypted email account. And we've used it for years back and forth. And he had a propensity to send articles to me, often like insider threat related. And so I got an email from him and he said, hey, Shawnee, I saw this article about insider threat and I thought you would like it. And I was like, cool. And I tried to open it and it wouldn't open. So I emailed him back and I said, hey, it won't open. Maybe could you send it like PDF or something? And he was very nice. And he wrote back right away, sure, no problem. And when I tried to open the PDF, it was like gibberish. And I thought, well, maybe he's old. Maybe he just doesn't know how to do it. And I ignored it. And then about A month or two later, Jerry, the FBI came knocking, and they said that they showed me an intelligence report, and they said that a nation state, and I won't name who, but a nation state had targeted me. And clearly they knew that I would fall for that link, both who it was and what he sent. And just a kind of a takeaway that I have from this and why I share this publicly is because, first of all, this can happen to anyone, even people who teach it. But also, when I told my colleague what had happened and that his email obviously had been compromised, he said, Shawnee, you should have known that was me. And I said, but how? And he said, I sign all of my emails hugs. And these emails didn't have that hugs signature. So it just reminds me that, you have to pay attention to the little things and the nuances.
I mean, not this is not a statement about your awareness or your judgment, but hey, if you, right, the person who's done this and now helps organizations go through this, the threats for the average person that isn't even aware of this, right? The hypersensitivity or the awareness, right? Their spidey senses are not up. And so, I think it's also important perhaps to mention to folks as an individual, hey, if you get, if you click a thing that's wrong or, whatnot, like the people who are out to get you are smarter. They, have a different set of morals. And so, we're talking, yeah. And we're talking about this so that we can prevent it. And so this is not a, hey, if you click the wrong thing, you're such a bad person or, everything is your fault. Like it happens. I mean, I'm like, my spidey senses are pretty good. I think about like, hey, if my mom got this, like, would she click on it? Like it's all, a lot of the things that we talk about. And like you said, they targeted you because it was a trusted sender. And so your guard perhaps isn't as high as getting a text message from a random phone number as we do so often today.
Yeah, totally. And with that, the AI scraping, when I'm saying it's targeted to you, they know what food you like, who you're attracted to, where you want to travel, and they will leverage those bits of information so that you are incredibly likely to click on it. It's brilliant.
So, safe to say there's a lot of different ways that these threats come into organizations, into our lives. Walk us through some of the different types of insider threats and what typically leads somebody to go down that path.
Yeah. So their insider threat is very interesting. Obviously, I think so. You have to look at it like it's a big umbrella. All right. So under that umbrella, you have things like fraud, sabotage, espionage, theft of intellectual property, media leaks, workplace violence, etc. Before I get into the common categories, I also just kind of want to emphasize that in any case where you're dealing with humans, you have to consider what are their motivations and vulnerabilities. So some people assume espionage, for example. So espionage is all about the money, but it's not. You have to understand why that individual is motivated by money. Like, what do they need the money for? And motivations can change just as life happens and we all hit our own personal rock bottom. We have stressors, personal, professional, external, right? So all of that has to be factored in. So I think, well, there's a couple things. First of all, again, before I get into the types, I think it's important that people understand there are differences between insider risk and insider threat. And so if you look at insider risk, this is what we call like left of boom, before the bad thing has happened. This is the risk that every organization, our audience, that may have just by employing humans. Humans make mistakes. We take shortcuts, right? We fall for phishing links. Insider threat is after the bad thing has happened or when someone's disgruntled and it's kind of snowballed. So when you get to the common categories, there are three main categories. So the first, kind of, if there's a pyramid at the bottom, the large majority are unintentional or negligent insiders. These are people that are not trying to cause harm. They're careless. They clicked on a link, or maybe they use password 1234. And so they're not maliciously trying to sabotage the company or do damage, but the damage they can do is just as severe potentially. The next category, like if we're going up on the pyramid, would be compromised insiders. And this is where threat actors are preying on those unintentional or negligent insiders. So these are employees that have had their credentials stolen or they're being coerced. Maybe a hacker phishes their login, things like that. So on the surface, they look like loyal employees, but their accounts are being used against the organization. Now, before I get to the third category, I will say that the good news is that those two categories in large part can be kind of trained away. You can train them and help them understand how they're vulnerable and what they're doing to be vulnerable. The last category, the small, like the tip of that pyramid, are the malicious insiders. Now, these are people obviously who intentionally cause harm. They're not going to get training and be like, wow, Shawnee said I shouldn't do that. And I'm not going to do that. But by training and educating your workforce, they now understand what a change in pattern of behavior means or what red flag indicators there are. And so they should understand then that when, Bob from accounting, sorry for any Bobs from accounting out there, but when Bob from accounting is acting weird or hey, something has changed, that they feel safe and empowered to report it. And then one other category that especially for HR professionals, you really, really need to look at those disgruntled insiders. This is where HR comes in and is really critical. So those employees who feel overlooked or mistreated or undervalued, those are people who oftentimes become high risk. And resentment builds over time. Like think about a bad relationship you've been in, right? When it kind of just gets worse and worse, that leadership doesn't tend to recognize it or they write it off. And then that bitterness can manifest as data theft or policy violations or sabotage, et cetera.
As you're going through these scenarios, Shawnee, I'm not a huge fan, but I'm a big fan of, spy movies. And these are all scenarios that we've seen play out on big screens and on our phones. And it's, it is there perhaps written by another human being because these are, realistic situations of a disgruntled person saying, I'm going to get you, or it's a lonely person who, finds the love of their life all of a sudden and is, putting themselves at risk, or it's the latest movie I saw, somebody works as a bartender for years to, play the long game. And then it's all these things. And, how do you spot these signs early without, living your entire life trusting nobody, without living every day, just anxiety, that you don't share anything with anybody? How do you balance that? And as organizations, as leaders in organizations, how can you institutionalize perhaps the risk mitigation up front to spot some of these things earlier?
Yeah, I like that question. So spotting insider threats early is really about tuning into behavioral changes. A lot of companies think it's technical and you'll see technical red flags. But the truth is, most people don't wake up one morning and just decide to be a malicious insider. It doesn't happen, right? It builds over time. And there are almost always signals along the way and red flags. When you look at like fraud and espionage, for example, not fraud and espionage, sorry, sabotage and espionage, for example, they've done studies that those two categories of malicious insider threats had almost the same red flags and indicators before someone does it. So what organizations can look for is behavioral shifts, right? Someone who was once maybe collaborative, suddenly they isolate themselves. Or the opposite, someone who becomes like overly interested in projects or something outside of their scope. Access. So like if someone is requesting, access to meetings that they shouldn't be invited to, or they're suddenly downloading large amounts of data, or they're logging in at odd hours, that's a red flag, obviously. And then I would say emotional cues. When employees are expressing resentment or financial stress or frustration with leadership, HR often is the first one to see this in things like performance reviews or exit interviews or casual conversations. These aren't things that should be dismissed at all. Like these have to be taken seriously, especially a lot of times people, if they are even lucky enough to get exit interviews, I feel like that's something that should be pushed a little bit more. Taking that and really, chewing on what was said, because when people are on their way out, they're usually a bit more brutally honest than if they're not on the way out. So yeah, I don't know. And we could get into training and awareness and all those things. But yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot. The thing is, people just have to pay attention. And I will add also that in today, like post-COVID, where so much is remote, a lot of companies, a lot of teams will just jump into a call and like get down to business. And you shouldn't do that. Remember, again, that human connection. We all need human connection. And so, hey, Jerry, how are you? How's the family? What's going on? How's your health? Whatever it is, spending time, some people don't like the small talk, but it's not really small talk if you're spending the time trying to see how someone is truly doing, and then you can see that change in pattern of behavior.
As you were talking, I forget the specifics or how many organizations, but a few weeks ago, we all learned about this person who had like 12 jobs. And, they were that's a huge security risk, right? Because you get access to files and you get access to things. And aside from the legal and the moral gray area of having multiple jobs, like these organizations did not vet this person to flag that as a risk. Um, Obviously, on the front end, it was a big fail, and it was a in the middle too, in just terms of scheduling meetings, perhaps. And um, when we think about from an HR perspective, sort of the entire human lifecycle management, from recruiting to interviewing, onboarding, training, and then ongoing. Are there particular points where there's more vulnerability, or is there a particular point on the flip side where once you get past sort of the valleys of sorts that it's not as risky once they're in the organization?
Yeah, that's excellent. So, in the audience, everyone here should know what that employee life cycle is. But I think most people don't recognize that it's really tightly tied to insider threat and mitigating insider threat. So, for me, throughout this life cycle, you've got two touch points that are probably the most important from the hiring and the termination phase. With hiring and onboarding, first of all, advertising jobs honestly is really important. I can't tell you how many times I've seen investigations or issues where someone thought they were getting this great job and they sat at their desk and then the boss said, "You can't have your cell phone." Well, they didn't know that. That was never explained to them. And so suddenly you have someone disgruntled because that was never honestly shared. But also culture fit. When people are interviewing and the hiring manager, the team that's doing the interviews, are they truly doing a deep dive into culture fit? Because if you think about it, especially with AI now, again, I can use AI to come up with all the great answers that you're going to ask me. I can know everything about your company in bullet points. I can look great on paper. My resume will be perfect. But if no one's truly digging in to see if I'm a good culture fit, again, you're going to bring someone on that is a potential insider threat because I'm not going to like how you do business. And then with termination, that is probably one of the most important triggers because if it's not done right or it's not done thoughtfully, say HR has to shut off access early before the person can send that, "Oh, farewell. It's been so great working with you all." That makes people mad. And depending on the person, the situation, remember every case is different. That could cause sabotage. That's the moment where we see sabotage most likely is those terminations. But then, everything else is important too. You've got the development and retention and engagement because like I said earlier, you want people to feel valued, you want them to feel heard, you want them to feel like the company cares about them. So it's all super, super critical and it's all tied to mitigating human risk.
Give us you mentioned, a mismanaged or poorly managed offboarding, can have drastic effects. Not, just because of that, you can't have access, you can't say bye, or, security shows up to your desk physically and saying, "Hey, you have 3 minutes to pack up." Just sort of that, nice touch at the end, or not even a nice touch, but just a human touch could
Yeah.
avoid all of this. Do you have any examples of something that went wrong that could have been avoided? Because it feels like, when an organization decides to terminate a relationship, some leaders see that as the finite ending and saying, "Hey, who cares? You're done. Let's walk you out and be done with it." But it sounds like there's a lot of potential there for either handling it properly, or that is a point of a tremendous amount of risk.
Yes, there is a tremendous amount of risk. And there are a lot of reasons why. It could be because HR and the security team are not communicating effectively, or they're not kind of on that same team, one team, one fight kind of thing. There was a case that I actually investigated, I worked on, where we had an employee who was super high risk. He was, we thought, potentially violent. He was just a very negative, not nice person. We thought he was stealing stuff. So I notified HR that we were terminating him and we needed this HRBP to cut off his access at a certain time of day. It was in the morning. We also told her that we had extra physical security there or like around the room, the termination room. because we were worried that he was going to get physical. So it was quite a stressful termination. Now, after, he was notified the termination happened, he was actually very calm. Everyone was very, whew, okay. Uh, and I messaged her and I said, "Hey, did you shut off? Just confirming you shut off access." And I didn't hear back for hours and hours. And then finally, it was probably about 5 p.m. She got back to me and she said, "Oh, I just did it." And I was like, What?" And she said, "Well, he seemed so nice and he didn't seem upset to me. So I just waited until the end of the day." So what we did was we did a very quick digital forensic examination and found that from the time he was terminated or notified to the time that she shut off access, he had literally downloaded, he had copied his whole machine. He stole everything. We had to actually engage outside counsel and try to get him to delete things, and it dragged on forever and it got nasty, and he was really, really nasty to deal with. So it was painful, it was bad, but it could have been prevented, if that communication had just been better.
Yeah, I on both sides though, right, Shawnee? We're talking about human beings who, I mean, I guess in multiple angles, human beings who are trying to infiltrate, human beings who are responding to an emotion, but also you're also dealing with human beings who are trying to make decisions or make calls. At the end of the day, as you mentioned, as we know, human beings are wired to trust. We are not, necessarily. It just feels icky to assume the worst in people, particularly right when you're delivering bad news that can change that person's life and livelihood. Obviously, it is a lot, but these scenarios are things that either folks have experienced, witnessed, whether it's in real life or in fictional storylines, because they probably do happen a lot more than we think. And it is, perhaps the better to be safe than sorry is probably the most cliche thing that we can say here. Always take that precaution of whether it is, doing it a little bit earlier or having another person there, because that risk isn't just physical. It is, financial, it is legal, and it potentially
Reputational.
could, yeah, and it
Yeah.
could be the life, blood of the company for a while. When we think about this topic of risk management from bad actors internally, externally, and all the things, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but who owns it at the end of the day? And should there be a particular point person in the C-suite? How do you divide, if not, this sort of role and responsibility to make sure that you have a singular point of person, or is it not a singular point of person, but more of a by committee to make sure that all the precautions and the risks are managed?
Yeah. So that's actually super important for people to think about. And I'm going to give you a spy answer. It depends. Every organization is different. Every organization has a very different organizational culture, and you have to take that culture into account when you're devising these programs. Um, Look at a human, so you can call, and again, you can call it human risk management program, an insider threat program, a human risk program, an insider trust program. I don't care. Just have a program. But you have to look at it like a hub, and you have all these spokes going out. So those spokes go to all of the stakeholders. And what I really like about these programs is that those stakeholders are everyone, because everyone touches human risk. You've got internal audit, you've got compliance, you've got HR, you've got ER, you've got legal, you've got IT security, you've got global investigations, like you name it, somebody has a piece of it. And so to really have success, I don't care where it sits. Again, just have the program. Um, I've seen it under legal. I've seen it under many, many different things. Global security is very common. Risk is very common. But the critical piece is to have that hub and spoke system where you have a working group where you have maybe 2 members of each one of those stakeholders. And I say 2 because one's going to be on vacation at some point. We're always need a backup and we need consistency. So you've got 2 members of each stakeholder. And then you've got a steering committee on top of that of C-suite or VIPs, right, in the organization, because you have to have buy-in from the very top. And I've worked with organizations and for organizations that didn't have that buy-in, and we were it's like pushing a huge boulder uphill. You have to have that support, and they have to push that down. And then one other thing that's really, really critical is this is not like a secret squirrel program. This is a program that you want everyone to know exists, and you want to have an awareness campaign about it, and you want to make it, I always call it the cool kids club, right? You want people to be watching the news and think, oh my gosh, that was insider threat. And I learned that when I saw that webinar, and I want to tell my security team. And then, you get that engagement, and it works. I've done it. But again, you're trying to get engagement from employees. You're trying to get engagement and that kind of kumbaya, one team, one fight with the stakeholders. And that's really the best way to do it.
As we look towards the future, currently, I think it's safe to say that there's a lot of, division, there's misinformation, there's disinformation. AI today is the worst that will ever be. There's also the loneliness epidemic that gets studied and shared about, which means that the risk for human intervention and social engineering, as you mentioned, perhaps increases because people are longing for that connection and then perhaps put their guard down. Um, I don't want to make the end of our conversation the negative Nancy or downer part of the conversation, but how does this risks change? And and then to put a positive spin on things, what can we start thinking about today, or what can leaders start thinking about today to make sure that we minimize that? How does the technology change how we view this risk over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. So I think you have a few things. You're going to have definitely a blurring of personal and professional boundaries. And we've seen that with COVID, right? When you have employees working from their kitchen table one day and co-working space the next, corporate data is living everywhere. And then you throw in personal devices, all those Internet of things, and they're mixing with your work devices. And so the attack surface is expanding. And so what we're going to see is more unintentional insider threat. Again, that's where that training and awareness, that education comes in. AI-powered manipulation, we've touched on it a couple times, but again, you have to think in espionage, building trust with the source took me months. It could take years. And AI, they can shorten that time frame, and they can fake that in seconds. So you've got deep fakes and voice clonings and tailored phishing that will make it almost impossible for employees to tell real from fake. So you have to help them understand what that is. You've got, and you touched on this too, like global and cultural complexity. So as teams become more global, you will see more nuanced insider risks tied to cultural pressures or local regulations or geopolitical influence. So you might have a remote employee in another country who is facing cultural or social or financial coercion in ways that headquarters can't see. I mentioned unintentional or accidental insiders that, like I said, is going to be huge. And then I guess, like, to end on a good one, on a positive one, I firmly believe, and I'm seeing the trend, that human risk is becoming more of a leadership priority. People are starting to recognize, this is a thing, and maybe we need to do something about it. The problem is nobody knows how to do it or what to do, but boards and C-suites and HR are starting to kind of embrace it and starting to take action. So I think that's kind of the direction that things are going.
And I do want to leave our conversation on a positive note, Shawnee. Of all the things that we talked about, it also seems like an insurmountable task to try to get everything buttoned up, or to, again, not to live a daily life of just massive anxiety, thinking that the person that you run into in the coffee shop is trying to, hack your brain to steal something. What is the one thing that our leaders can do today to strengthen the human side of cybersecurity and to lead their organizations and also to protect themselves for a better world tomorrow?
I would say make security personal. Too often, cybersecurity as a whole feels really abstract. Everyone hears about firewalls and patches and policies, but people need to understand why it matters to them and their families and their work. So you have to play, just like the threat actors, you have to play on natural human trust. What is in it for me? Companies are constantly saying, in their horrible, horrible training, do this, don't do this because we said so. But you have to tailor those messages for how is that going to help that employee at home and with their family. I really think that helping educate them in good cyber hygiene at home and saying, hey, this is how you can protect your family, or here's some really bad things that kids are facing, and we want to share it with you. Your kids don't work here, but we care about you and your families. What that does is that builds that good cyber hygiene, that builds that good muscle memory, so to speak, and so they'll take it back to the workplace. Also, leaders need to model the behavior, right? We've seen things in the news recently where senior leaders are not modeling the behavior that they're saying everyone else has to do. So you have to model that. And a big, big, big part also is making security a cultural value. I think cultural values should be kind of living documents, and they should be updated over time. Bring in your employees, solicit their opinions, see what do they think should be our new cultural values, and then have a whole awareness campaign about it and make security one of them. Make it cool, do the engagement, and when you're doing engagement and when you're doing training and we're doing awareness, you have to use stories. Again, you're pushing into that human traits, but when you tell stories, people remember it. When you're telling stats and numbers, people are like in one ear and out the other. Right? And I have a million stories. That's what I do in my training. I don't stop with the stories, but it's because it works, right? And then I think, lastly, I would say just really empower your people. Don't scare them. When people feel like they are not safe to report, and I've worked in multiple organizations where there was either no confidential reporting or there was retaliation if someone did report. And I faced both of those situations. People have to be safe and they have to feel empowered because you're already going against that natural human trait of, I don't want to be a rat. I don't want to be a tattletale. And that's a hard thing to push past. So just getting them to push past that and feel safe and report, you will get a lot more reports and a lot more things to look at, which means obviously a lot more risk assessments, but it will really benefit you in the long run.
Shawnee, this has been a fascinating conversation. I hope that our audience leaves this conversation with a little bit more knowledge, comfort, and more direction in how they can protect themselves, both in their personal but also in their professional lives. Shawnee Delaney, CEO of Vaillance Group, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and stay safe out there.
That will do it for this week's episode. See you next time on Tomorrowist. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe to Tomorrowist wherever you get your podcast. We also publish a weekly newsletter with in-depth articles and the latest SHRM research to help keep you in the know about the trends shaping the future of work. You can subscribe and find all of our episodes on our website at shrm.org/Tomorrowist. Thanks for listening. And remember, the workplace is changing rapidly. You don't have to be a futurist, be a Tomorrowist.
SHRM.